Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking on something really big,
Hmm.
a topic that's both, I think, really challenging and just completely essential for how we navigate the world today.
Right.
And that's the institution of science itself. We always talk about science as this, this pure, almost perfect ideal, this rigorous, disinterested method for finding truth.
The ideal. Yeah.
But what happens when the very human structure that we build to uphold that ideal, what happens when it becomes, ironically, its greatest barrier?
And that right there is the core question we're trying to unpack.
Mhm.
We have to move beyond thinking about science as just a faculty of the mind, like logic or reason.
Right.
We have to confront it as a vast human edifice. It's a culture, it's a career ladder, it's a funding system, a whole set of social rules.
Institution.
A whole institution. And there's this great warning from the philosopher William James that when institutions get big and powerful enough, they often end by becoming obstacles to the very purposes which their founders had in view. So we're really examining how that exact process has affected the pursuit of scientific truth.
It's a really challenging idea, though, because it immediately makes you confront how much we rely on authority. I mean, the amount of scientific knowledge out there today it's just so explosive.
Oh, completely.
No single person, I don't care how brilliant they are, no specialist can really evaluate the validity of findings outside of their own tiny, tiny little corner of the world.
That's right. So the rest of us, the public, governments, even other scientists, we have to rely on the pronouncements of some established authority.
You have to take it on faith, basically.
Exactly. We're acting on a necessary faith anytime we say, well, science teaches that X is true. So the real mission of this deep dive is to scrutinize just how reliable that authority actually is.
Because we have this idealized vision, don't we? That science is always collective, totally disinterested, always self-correcting through peer review, and that it always leads to balanced, evidence-based policy. But the reality, the day-to-day practice, can be, well, it can fall pretty short.
Detrimentally short in many cases. And we need to, anatomize the ways the actual culture and the structure can betray that ideal.
And this isn't, to be clear, an anti-science position. It's the opposite. It's a necessary critique to improve the institution, to maybe restore some of that public trust.
They're absolutely. And, while this whole structural critique stands up perfectly well on its own,
Right.
It's also impossible to ignore how the flaws we see.
The narrowness, the fragmentation.
Exactly. The
Ah.
enforced narrowness, the excessive technicalization, all that fragmentation of knowledge into these little silos, they really echo these well-established patterns of human cognition.
Oh, okay.
So we'll see throughout this dive how an over-reliance on that kind of fragmented approach really impacts the holistic pursuit of truth.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's unpack this institution, starting with, I guess, the foundational bias that has really defined modern science, specialization.
Specialization is, it's the logical, maybe even the inevitable consequence of success. The sheer explosion of knowledge, especially since the 17th century, has just forced all inquiry to become intensely specialized.
It's just too big for one person to grasp.
Way too big. So the scientist has to burrow deeper and deeper into a narrower and narrower hole.
I'm thinking of that Robert Heinlein quote from the sources, "Specialization is for insects." It's obviously meant to be provocative, but there's a serious point there.
There is. The physicist Erwin Schrödinger made it really well. He said that for a scientist's work to have any real significance, it has to ultimately fit into the bigger picture.
The broader context of what? Science, philosophy, human life?
All of it. If you can't see outside the narrow confines of your little subdiscipline, how can you possibly determine if your findings truly matter or, how they connect to the larger human project?
And that's where this danger structural bias gets imported. The historian Arnold Toynbee talked about this.
He did. He critiqued the spread of what he called the bureaucratic state of mind into intellectual inquiry.
And what does that mean exactly? The bureaucratic mindset.
It's a mindset that loves rigid rules, fixed processes, measurable outputs. And that kind of thinking just obstructs the freedom of thought and the wide-ranging debate that are the lifeblood of real intellectual advances. It puts efficient execution above imaginative scope.
Toynbee had the great metaphor, the architectural one, that really illustrates this.
Oh, the Japanese house. It's perfect.
Yeah, he argued that intellectual structures shouldn't be like a Western house with these fixed, load-bearing walls that lock everything into place.
No, exactly. They should be like a Japanese house with movable screens. The fixed walls are those interdisciplinary dividing lines we put up everywhere.
The silos?
The silos, yeah. between physics and philosophy or biology and psychology. And those walls make any kind of flexible thinking impossible. But if you have movable screens, you can create new intellectual configurations at a moment's notice. You can let ideas flow, let disciplines merge when a problem really demands that bigger panoramic view.
And when those walls get fixed, we lose what he called stereoscopic vision.
We do. We lose the ability to see the depth, the context, the third dimension of our subject, and that loss is devastating.
Because you need both.
You need both. You need the complementary perspectives, the bird's eye view of the generalist who can see the whole lay of the land, and the fly's eye view of the specialist who can analyze the texture of a single leaf.
Specialization is great for technical skill.
Indispensable for it, but it's
Yeah.
not enough. When that microscopic, fragmented view isn't balanced by the panoramic one, the deeper meaning of what you're studying is just. It's left unplumbed.
So the specialization means that the most critical questions aren't just going unanswered.
They're not even being asked. Exactly. The focus is always relentlessly on how to measure this, how to solve that technical problem, not what does it mean or why are we even solving it in the first place. We have structurally mandated this either thinking when the pursuit of truth demands both hand.
And that leads straight into this really perverse career structure. The incentives are all about digging deeper into that one narrow hole.
Oh, absolutely. The system promotes the person who just focuses on their tiny validated area, the person who looks up, who takes the time to synthesize different findings, who tries to figure out what all this spade work is actually for. That person is risking career suicide.
The physicist John Archibald Wheeler put it so bluntly.
He did. If you're working on something new, then you are necessarily an amateur. Specialists end up knowing, like the old saying goes, more and more about less and less.
That structural penalty for being original is captured so well by that astronomer Jack Eddy and his experience with the valley floor analogy.
Yeah, Eddy realized that the biggest discoveries often happen between the rigid boundaries of the existing disciplines, in that terra incognita. The valley floor analogy explains the whole professional hazard perfectly.
So the goal is to see the mountain ranges, to see progress.
Right, but you can only see those shapes by rising above the specific hole where you're digging. If you just stay on the valley floor, your progress is only measured by how deep your own personal hole gets.
And if you never climb out, you have no context. You don't really know why the work you're doing in the valley even matters.
It just becomes, as the physicist Lee Smolin says, mere technical problem solving.
And that's a self-defeating fantasy, isn't it?
Yeah.
The philosopher John Dewey insisted that the big advances they require, what was it? A new audacity of imagination.
Audacity of imagination and general ideas. You can't solve foundational problems just by mechanically extending a technique. If science only expands its technical know-how, its power to control, without a corresponding advance in wisdom, well, we face a pretty grave danger.
Which is exactly the fear that Jonas Salk, the man who developed the polio vaccine, articulated so clearly.
Salk asked this incredible question. At one time we had wisdom, but little knowledge. Now we have a great deal of knowledge, but do we have enough wisdom to deal with that knowledge?
Wow.
That's the risk right there. It's like giving incredibly powerful machine guns to people whose only training is in how to pull the trigger efficiently, without ever having been taught morality or context.
This big structural shift in attitude was something Erwin Chargaff also saw. He was crucial to the whole DNA field.
Yeah, Chargaff just lamented this profound shift from a broad, creative pursuit of knowledge for its own sake to what he called the utility-drunk and goal-directed attitude that just dominates everything now.
The pressure to produce something useful, measurable, technical.
It's completely changed the mindset of researchers, and he used that heartbreaking tapestry metaphor to describe what we've lost.
That image really does stick with you.
It does. He saw this wonderful, inconceivably intricate tapestry of nature being aggressively taken apart, strand by strand.
So each thread is analyzed, torn up, categorized.
Right. And the consequence of this super localized reductionist effort is that even the memory of the design is lost and can no longer be recalled.
You lose the whole shape, the gestalt.
The very thing you set out to study in the first place. And he connected this directly to the type of people who are now entering science, people who thrive on conformity, on following the boss, on working within the prevailing fashions, not people driven by a broad intellectual curiosity.
Which is why, I guess, we have to remember that so many of the real intellectual giants, Darwin, Freud, Einstein, they often did their most paradigm-shifting work alone, outside the conventional academic structure. They communicated their big ideas through lectures or books.
Comprehensive books, yeah.
Yeah.
Things that allow for the proper development and integration of broad ideas. But that format, that method of communication, is now profoundly disincentivized.
Which brings us to the next big problem. The actual mechanisms of output. How the publication machine itself actively degrades the quality of the knowledge being produced.
Right. The problem is the central mechanism of the whole academic career, the pressure to publish. Because quantity is prioritized over quality, and because big, comprehensive works like books have little to no impact factor for tenure and promotion,
The little technical papers, are valued way more than the whole idea.
it's the ultimate victory of what they call salami slicing rules, where a single finding gets sliced into the maximum possible number of publishable papers.
And the result for you, the listener, for the general public, and even for other scientists, is this profound drift towards inaccessibility.
It's so true. Since the late 20th century, the language of research has become just so heavily acronymic, jargon-laden, exclusionary.
The paper isn't written to inform anymore.
No, it's written to validate the author's technical expertise within a tiny subdiscipline. Human description is systematically kicked out, replaced by technical data from a computer analysis of cohorts using specialized tools.
Which makes these studies totally alienating to an intelligent, non-specialist reader, or even a scientist just one field over.
The whole openness of science is threatened when only, a handful of people in the entire world can actually understand the language being used.
And this seems especially toxic and feels like neuroscience and psychology, which we're most interested in here. The focus is so heavily on mechanism and technical measurement that the subject itself, the person, the conscious experience, is at risk of being lost entirely.
It's a massive disconnect. Michael Gazzaniga, who is a giant in cognitive neuroscience, he admitted he was not comfortable relating his lab research on brain mechanisms to clinical psychiatric experience.
A leader in brain research found it hard to connect his findings to actual human beings.
It says everything, doesn't it? Gazzaniga famously asserted the brain is as mechanical as clockwork.
That reductionist view, treating the human mind like a machine, it just fundamentally contradicts the ambition of science to help us understand the whole person.
It does, which is why Jonas Salk called for integrators as distinct from the reductionists. We desperately need people who are capable of synthesis, who can understand the whole, which is far greater than the sum of the parts. The narrow, technical, fragmented approach just can't do that.
And what happens when these scientists who have deep technical expertise but lack that contextual view? What happens when they avoid philosophy?
Well, they can't really avoid philosophy entirely because every scientific practice is already based on philosophical assumptions about reality, truth, and causality.
So what do?
Instead of engaging with those assumptions thoughtfully, they often just impose a default kind of naive materialism. They assume, often without even thinking about it, that only what can be measured is real.
Which leads to this fatal conceit.
That their technical expertise in, say, neuroscience somehow qualifies them to lay down the law on huge philosophical subjects they know nothing about, like consciousness or ethics.
Which is exactly what Nietzsche warned against. That science, after rightly resisting the authority of theology, was now trying to lay down laws for philosophy and play the philosopher itself.
But with this profound and frankly arrogant lack of understanding of the philosophical project, it's the arrogance born of specialization and bureaucratization. They confuse mastery of technique with mastery of wisdom.
Okay, so moving on from the structural biases in the culture, we have to now get into the really sticky question of how reliable the actual evidence is, especially when it comes to the tools of modern neuroscience that are shaping our entire understanding of the brain.
Right. And for you, the learner, it's so crucial to understand the tools that are being used to draw these big conclusions about the brain. So much of the research relies on functional neuroimaging, fMRI, and PET scans, and we have to be just rigorously cautious about how we interpret that data.
We should probably distinguish between the two types of imaging first.
Good idea. So structural imaging, like a basic MRI or a CT scan that just shows the anatomy, the bones, the tissues, any lesions, that data is generally considered, more or less unimpeachable. It's a living map.
But functional imaging is different.
It's way more complex. It's measuring activity metabolism or changes in blood flow, and its interpretation is inherently and profoundly uncertain.
Okay, so what are some of these inherent pitfalls when we're trying to interpret these incredibly complex functional data sets?
The first difficulty is just the sheer scale and complexity of the analysis. A single fMRI experiment generates these massive data sets, which have to be run through complex statistical software packages. There was this widely reported paper back in 2016 that suggested a single software bug might have invalidated, get this, 15 years of fMRI research.
15 years of research, potentially resting on a statistical error. That's shocking.
It shows you how fragile the interpretation is. The problem is that the statistical process involves running hundreds of thousands of independent statistical tests across these tiny little segments of the brain. They're called voxels.
And when you run that many tests,
You exponentially inflate the number of false positives. You find something that looks statistically significant just by pure chance. And even though that specific 2016 claim was hotly debated and partially corrected, the underlying lesson is sound. Drawing the right inferences from complex computer-generated data is a very, very uncertain process.
in the context where the data is gathered, that seems fundamentally unnatural.
Oh, it is. Functional imaging requires people to lie perfectly still inside a giant, noisy tube while doing these highly constrained tasks. It's an extremely unusual context to try and generalize from about, spontaneous, real-world human behavior.
Tiny variations could make a huge difference.
Massive differences. Small changes in how the task is presented, or even just the subject's anxiety levels inside the machine, can yield huge differences in the results. Science often takes not just the data, but the people themselves completely out of context.
Then you have the problem of the pretty pictures, the aesthetically appealing but often misleading image of a single spot lighting up on a scan.
We call that the localization fallacy. The brain operates as a widely distributed network, not a set of little local modules firing off in isolation.
So the area that lights up.
It often hides as much as it reveals. That activation might be secondary, or maybe even a regulatory response to activity happening somewhere else entirely. Elkanon Goldberg used a great metaphor for this.
This was the Mount Ararat one.
Yeah, trying to surmise the entire post-flood landscape of Mesopotamia just by staring only at the peak of Mount Ararat sticking out above the water. You're only seeing one tiny isolated piece, which tells you nothing about the complexity of all the valleys hidden below.
And what the activity itself even means is incredibly ambiguous. I think the source material used the automobile analogy to make this clear.
It's a perfect illustration of all the interpretive uncertainties. So imagine you were trying to understand a car, but all you could do was measure its fuel consumption and its electrical usage.
Okay.
So increased fuel consumption. What could that mean? It could be a high-performance sports car, it could be a poorly tuned old clunker, or it could be a totally normal car, but it's driving with the emergency brake on.
Radically different states, but they all just register as high activity.
Exactly. And electrical activity could be the safety lights or the wipers or the sound system blasting. Without understanding the whole system, the isolated data points are basically meaningless.
And here's a really counterintuitive finding that just throws a wrench in the common interpretation of fMRI scans: the expertise paradox.
Right. Most people assume that more activity must equal better function. But in a lot of cases, the reverse is true. Only effortful or novel tasks tend to register as high activity.
So the more expert you are at something,
The less brain activity you show because you're doing it more efficiently. And what's more, people who score higher on IQ tests actually correlate with lower cerebral metabolic rates during mentally active conditions. Their brains are just more efficient at problem solving.
so you have to be extremely cautious when interpreting these simple activation studies. The part of the brain that's quiet might be the most proficient.
Precisely. And a really crucial distinction in human function inhibition versus activation is also completely obscured by these methods.
Oh, so?
Well, so much of human consciousness and advanced function relies on inhibitory processes, our ability to stop, to filter, to prevent ourselves from doing something.
Right.
Yet current fMRI methods can make inhibition functionally indistinguishable from excitation or activation. If we can't reliably tell when the brain is actively stopping a process versus actively starting one, we've got a massive blind spot in how we interpret sophisticated human behavior.
And finally, in the context of our hemisphere research, just lumping all the data together from diverse groups can be profoundly misleading.
This is what they call the neuroimagers fallacy. The statistical process often aggregates data across these large cohorts, which you need for statistical power. But when you aggregate data that includes, say, equal numbers of men and women, or people with different handedness,
You can wash out the result.
you can completely cancel each other out. Significant and opposite lateralizing tendencies can just disappear. The result looks like a null finding, no difference between the hemispheres, when in reality there were profound, distinct differences within those subgroups. The complexity of human variability is sacrificed for statistical simplification.
So if functional imaging has all these built-in uncertainties, what do we know about the brain that's actually more reliable?
The deficit literature. So, studies of patients who've suffered an acute loss of function from strokes or injuries or tumors. Lesion studies tend to be more consistent.
They're not perfect, though.
Not perfect, no, but their drawbacks tend toward false negatives. So, missing a connection that's there, rather than the false positives that plague these complex statistical methods. When you find a clear, repeated functional loss in the deficit literature, it's relatively reliable.
But even here, we have to remember Healings-Jackson's famous warning.
Yeah.
To locate the damage which destroys speech and to locate speech are two different things.
Exactly. And that applies just as much to functional imaging. Seeing a brain region is damaged and observing a resulting deficit is not the same as concluding that the damaged area is the location of that function. True knowledge comes from combining all these methods, lesion studies, EEG, functional imaging. It's the confrontation of these different methods that ultimately stabilizes what we know.
Okay, now let's zoom out and look at the general crisis of reliability across all of science, starting with the devastating statistics on replication.
The statistics are a major threat to that whole ideal of science as self-correcting. There was a massive collaborative study in Science magazine that tried to repeat experiments in psychology, and they found that only about 40% yielded statistically significant results.
Only 40%.
And in other areas, like cancer biology, the reproducibility rates were as low as 10%. A survey in Nature found that over 70% of researchers reported that they had failed to reproduce another scientist's experiment.
So that suggests the very foundation of our knowledge is way less stable than we assumed.
And this isn't just in the soft sciences dealing with humans.
Not at all. Even measurements of fundamental physical constants, the things we think of as the bedrock of reality, like the speed of light, they consistently underestimate their actual errors. And that's because the assessment of systematic errors, the unavoidable subjective judgments you have to make when setting up an experiment, well, it unavoidably involves an element of subjective judgment.
So there's always a human element.
Always. This widespread underestimation of uncertainty is a systemic problem, even in the most rigorous fields. The public is so often presented with these two extremes. Either science is perfect, or it's all a conspiracy. But the truth involves this complex, distorting prestige economy of publishing.
You see this perfectly in the impact factor paradox. So journals with a high impact factor, the ones seen as the most prestigious and rigorous, were found in some studies to be less likely to give an accurate estimate of an effect size than journals with a lower IF.
So the prestige of the journal doesn't actually correlate with the accuracy of the content.
Not necessarily, no. Which brings us to John Ioannidis' famous paper, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False.
What was his core argument about the structural pressures that lead to this failure?
Ioannidis argued that the vast majority of research is just inadequately designed because of low statistical power. It's not robust enough to find what it's looking for reliably. And this is compounded by intense competition. Teams prioritize disseminating these impressive positive results really quickly to beat their rivals to the punch.
And this pressure creates what he called the Proteus phenomenon.
Right, this rapid, confusing oscillation between these extreme claims and then equally rapid refutations that just confuse the public and distort the whole scientific field.
So the system rewards speed and flashy findings over slow, meticulous rigor.
Exactly. And Ioannidis also highlighted the ethical issues that go beyond just statistical mistakes. A lot of studies are conducted not for some disinterested search for truth, but primarily to give researchers the qualifications they need for promotion or tenure.
Which leads to practices like data mining or p-hacking.
P-hacking, yeah.
Yeah.
The process where researchers just keep analyzing their data with slightly different techniques, excluding outliers, tweaking variables, until they finally get that statistically significant p-value that makes publication far more likely, even if the finding is totally spurious.
That's a research misdemeanor. But what about just outright deliberate fraud?
The surveys are shocking. One survey found that 33% of scientists admitted to at least one of the 10 most common research misdemeanors in the previous 3 years. A senior editor reported that 1/3 of authors couldn't even find the original data to back up the figures in their own papers when they were questioned. And we have these massive documented cases of fabrication.
The case of the anesthetist is just staggering.
Yoshitaka Fuji. He fabricated 183 papers, netted him the world record for retracted science papers. These were completely invented clinical trials.
And the fact that the process failed to detect a fraud on that scale for so long is, well, it's profoundly damaging.
It is. The significance of this corruption is proportional to the claims that are ritually made on science's behalf. If the institution presents itself as the sole bastion of objective truth, then the revelation of mass fraud and systemic failures is particularly toxic. It undermines the very trust in that authority, especially since the public is often, gullible enough to believe that scientific pronouncements ipso facto represent the truth with a capital T.
And that sets the stage perfectly for our next section. How the very systems that are designed to process and filter scientific output are themselves broken and corruptible.
Right. The publish or perish system, where sheer quantity just trumps rigorous quality, is the central mechanism driving all of this institutional corruption. Universities demand an output quote of papers, regardless of whether the academic has anything genuinely new or important to say.
And that pressure prevents the necessary deep thinking. Ideas get crystallized too early before they've had that crucial fallow period of unconscious gestation that complex ideas need to mature.
So instead of a comprehensive, dawning new understanding, the gestalt, we just get these fragmented, premature data slices.
This also creates a massive systemic distortion through negative findings bias.
Yes. Positive findings that a drug or an intervention works are prestigious. They're easily published. Negative findings that an intervention does not work are much harder to publish, even though they are equally valuable for building a reliable evidence base. Richard Smith, the former editor of the BMJ, claimed this actively biases the entire informational foundation of modern medicine.
Because if the negative findings are never published, the whole field just incorrectly assumes those interventions are effective until someone spends years and millions of dollars to prove a negative.
Precisely. And the relentless pressure to publish leads to these absurd practices. Slicing your findings into 4 papers instead of 1, artificially complexifying the material to confuse reviewers, compressing results until they're nearly impenetrable.
And these methods are reinforced by the corrupting influence of metrics like the impact factor.
The IF is so easily gamed. Journals, they know their rating is tied to citations, so they'll commission self-citing reviews that artificially inflate the journal's standing, creating this synthetic prestige.
But the real damage is done when that journal metric is used as a proxy to measure an individual researcher's quality.
Which is completely absurd because the factor is based on the journal, not the paper's actual content. And that false metric promotes highly unethical behavior, like undeservedly adding names to author lists. People who have only a dim peripheral awareness of the research still demand to be listed as authors because papers have no career value otherwise.
It's just a transaction in the academic currency system.
It is, and this desperation breeds just profound carelessness.
The finding that only 20% of cited papers have actually been read is mind-boggling.
It is. 80% of citations are just copied from someone else's citation list. And this blind copying propagates misprints. Or in one humorous and desperate incident, it carried the comment, "Should we cite the crappy Gabor paper here?" which was accidentally included in the final published article.
Which leads us to the institutional breaking point, the corruption of the open access pay-to-publish model.
Right. The open access model was supposed to democratize knowledge by shifting the cost from the reader to the institution. But since accepting a paper generates revenue and declining it means you forego revenue, well, this model has been ruthlessly exploited by predatory publishers.
They charge fees without doing any real peer review.
None whatsoever, sometimes hundreds or thousands of dollars.
And the case of the computer scientist Peter Van Plu has become legendary for exposing this.
It really has. Van Plu submitted a paper that consisted entirely of the nonsensical phrase, "Get me off your fucking mailing list," repeated over and over for several pages, complete with the flow diagram of the title words.
And it was accepted.
It was accepted by the International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology after supposedly undergoing rigorous, anonymous peer review, requiring only a few formatting changes and a $150 fee.
Wow.
He declined to pay, obviously, but the hoax just demonstrated the sheer greed and the integrity vacuum in the system.
And when someone tries to expose this industrial-scale fraud, the institution often turns on them.
The story of the librarian Jeffrey Deal is a painful example of institutional inertia prioritizing its image over integrity. Beale meticulously tracked these predatory publishers. He listed over 1,000 on his blog, scholarly open access.
And he was forced to shut it down.
He was, due to threats and politics from his own corporatizing university, which preferred positive PR and grant money over confronting scientific integrity problems.
That is deeply disturbing. A university theoretically dedicated to truth, actively suppressing the person trying to ensure its cleanliness because the status quo was more comfortable.
Beale rightly argued that predatory publishing is one of the biggest threats to science, as it churns out tens of thousands of degrees, tenures, and promotions based on these easily accepted, fraudulent, or just nonsensical papers. The university, acting like a corporation, prioritizes positive output aimed at attracting paying customers, not truth.
And the absurdity extends to conference acceptances, too.
Oh, yeah. An IT lecturer named Christoph Bartnek, who knew nothing about nuclear physics, generated an abstract entirely using his iPhone's autocomplete function.
Under the fake name Iris Pear.
And submitted it to the International Conference on Atomic and Nuclear Physics. It was accepted within 3 hours, along with a request for a $1,099 registration fee. The gatekeepers were just utterly absent.
This confirms that the problem isn't unique to science. It's just human fallibility. It's corruption that you find in all enterprises. But it's especially toxic in science because of the perceived status of its pronouncements.
We grant science this unique authority in the modern world. So the fact that sophisticated computer-generated gibberish or a serial fabricator can penetrate the system undetected for so long severely undermines all the claims of objectivity and rigor. Which brings us to the supposed quality control mechanism itself, peer review.
We've already established that peer review is often absent or can be exploited. The corruption is often deliberate and systematic, not just accidental.
Yes. We've seen over 110 papers retracted because of peer review rigging. Researchers exploit vulnerabilities in these automated submission systems, often by suggesting reviewer contact details that route the request straight back to themselves or an accomplice. They're effectively self-administering the approval process.
It's a failure of social trust that no technical patch can really solve.
That's right. And Richard Smith, the former editor of the highly respected British medical journal, the BMJ, he was brutally honest about the state of the system.
What did he say?
He called peer review a flawed process full of easily identified defects with little evidence that it works. He concluded that its continuance relies more on faith than on facts. He described it as inconsistent, highly subjective, and basically a lottery.
A lottery.
You submit your carefully crafted study into this black box, the roulette wheel, and you just pray for publication in a major journal, which is the academic jackpot. He said reviewers often agree only slightly more than they would just by pure chance.
That's remarkable for a system so central to validating truth.
It's slow, it's expensive, it's prone to personal bias, and it's easily abused. And it's worth noting that peer review as we know it is pretty modern. Nature only formalized it in 1967.
And historically, it faced a lot of resistance. Einstein, for example, had only one of his 301 papers peer-reviewed, and he told the editor he would take his study elsewhere because he objected to the process.
Right, and historical examples show how this process, which was initially intended for quality control, can become an obstacle to genuinely new ideas. The system creates this profound structural bias against innovation and originality.
Why is peer review structurally incapable of dealing with novel ideas?
Because innovative hypotheses are highly vulnerable to being filtered out or just forced to conform to conventional wisdom. As the philosopher J.L. Auspitz noted, there are never peers to review unique work.
Right.
A system that's focused on measuring current accepted standards of methodology is structurally incapable of evaluating disruptive, paradigm-shifting ideas because those ideas necessarily break the existing standards. It forces conformity.
And its failure to detect basic, deliberate errors is almost comical.
The BMJ conducted these studies where they deliberately inserted major errors into papers they sent out for review. The reviewers, the supposed experts checking the material, spotted only about a quarter of the errors. Some spotted none at all. It just conclusively showed that the process is shockingly unreliable for eliminating error or fraud.
But the most damning evidence against the integrity of the system comes from the studies that demonstrate blatant bias based on institutional prestige.
The famous CC and Peter study is a perfect demonstration of this. They took 12 papers that had already been successfully published in prestigious high-impact factor journals. Then they changed the authors' names and their institutional affiliations to fictional, low-status institutions.
Things like the Northern Plains Center for Human Growth and Potential.
Exactly. And they resubmitted these papers to the same journals.
What was the result of this ingenious experiment?
Well, of the 12 resubmitted papers, 9 continued the review process, and 8 of those 9 were rejected.
Reject.
The stated grounds for rejection were often serious methodological flaws. The papers hadn't changed one bit, the quality was identical. But the institutional affiliation, the signal of prestige and funding, that was everything. It confirmed that the academic hierarchy profoundly influences what is deemed good science.
And the consequences for exposing this truth were not positive for the researchers.
No. Cece and Peters faced an intense and negative reaction from powerful individuals in their profession. Threats of lawsuits, of censure. They were effectively penalized for exposing the system's unreliability, which confirms that the academic establishment treats internal critique as a threat, reinforcing this culture of bureaucratic conformity over transparency.
So given that objectivity seems unattainable through the current system, what are the potential alternative models that experts like Richard Smith suggested?
Smith argued that having the value of a paper judged by the editor or a small, dedicated editorial staff would be just as effective, while being much quicker, cheaper, more transparent, and less open to malpractice. This system would rely on human, informed judgment, a kind of editorial guidance, and it acknowledges that bias is just intrinsic to human life.
So pretending to achieve an unattainable objectivity through a flawed bureaucratic system is actually more dangerous than acknowledging the human element from the start.
Exactly. The pretense of objective rigor fosters this false sense of security and complacency that actively stifles any necessary reform.
And we keep circling back to this central structural dilemma: time and originality. Truly original work takes years, sometimes decades to develop, and often years more just to be appreciated. The metric-driven institution actively punishes that slow gestation.
We mentioned that Crick and Watson's crucial DNA paper was cited rarely for its first 10 years. Imagine trying to get tenure with those citation metrics today. Originality and a high impact factor are just fundamentally incompatible metrics.
And we've seen this shift from the solitary giant to what's called the age of teams.
Right. Rutherford published his seminal paper on the structure of the atom all by himself. In contrast, the two 2012 papers announcing the Higgs particle each had roughly 1,000 authors.
And this isn't just a fun fact. The team structure fundamentally changes the nature of the inquiry.
It creates these small empires that are centered around massive government grants and expensive research machines. And this environment prioritizes predicted outcomes and grant acquisition over the freedom, imagination, and serendipity that are essential for foundational breakthroughs.
If you rely on these massive, years-long funding cycles, you can't afford to pursue risky, original, or unproven ideas.
You can't. Conformity to the grant application requirements becomes paramount. And the evidence suggests that this pursuit of bureaucratic efficiency has actually hurt scientific progress.
How so?
An analysis of millions of papers and patents showed that large groups generate fewer fundamentally novel ideas and that science has slowed enormously per dollar or hour spent. You can even see it in the Nobel Prize Committee, which has increasingly had to skip decades, especially in physics, to award prizes for older work because recent discoveries just lack that necessary revolutionary impact.
The relentless pursuit of measurable, fragmented efficiency is actively destroying long-term holistic effectiveness.
And this highly competitive hierarchical structure, it just pressures absolute conformity. It fosters a highly political environment. Lee Smolin critiqued the swaggering style used by leaders to intimidate questioners and enforce adherence to the prevailing paradigm.
That necessary balance between conformity and variety is lost.
It is. The system actively reduces the few corners where a creative person can pursue risky, original ideas without being penalized by statistical measures of achievement, like funding and citation levels.
And yet, history shows that open minds, often young minds, are the source of disruption.
It's astonishing how many of these seminal breakthroughs were achieved by scientists in their 20s. Newton at 23, Einstein at 25, Bohr, Heisenberg. It isn't necessarily because they were inherently smarter, but because their minds were more open than their seniors. They were less entrenched by years of conforming to the prevailing paradigm.
Max Planck articulated this sociological truth perfectly.
He did. A new scientific truth triumphs, not because it convinces its opponents and makes them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die.
But the institutional structure actively fights this sociological reality. It often rejects fundamental challenges, even when they're rooted in empirical analysis.
The case of Dr. Günter Beschly is a profound modern example of this kind of paradigm defense. He was a highly decorated curator of fossil insects who, after reading various sources, publicly supported the theory of intelligent design based on his empirical data analysis of the fossil record.
And the point here isn't the merit of intelligent design as a theory.
No, the point is the scientific establishment's response. Betchley was immediately forced out of his prestigious post and subsequently non-personed on Wikipedia. The establishment refused to entertain or welcome the challenge, showing a clear, defensive, dogmatic adherence to the prevailing evolutionary paradigm.
And we see this suppression of inconvenient data throughout history, including in neurology itself.
Yeah, Norman Geschrin noted that critically important information about hemisphere disconnection, the subtle but crucial effects of stroke on the corpus callosum, was almost totally suppressed for 60 years in the 20th century because it didn't happen to fit the prevailing theory.
So despite brilliant clinical descriptions by master observers,
The knowledge just disappeared from the literature because the intellectual climate wasn't ready to accommodate it.
which brings us to Thomas Kuhn's concept of normal science.
Kuhn argued that the vast majority of scientific work is essentially mopping up operations. It's aimed at forcing nature into the inflexible box of the prevailing paradigm, the established theory. Scientists are generally not trying to call forth new sorts of phenomena or invent new theories. They're trying to articulate the phenomena and theories the paradigm already supplies.
And this self-referential process is the essence of the structural bias we've been describing. It locks down the field into a kind of certainty.
It creates strong institutional resistance to those great creative insights that change the direction of scientific history. The certainty that one's beliefs must be right is a powerful human tendency, and it afflicts even the best scientists. Look at Tycho Brahe refusing Copernicus, or Justus von Liebig refusing the germ theory. Escaping this rigid adherence requires a moral courage to step out of line.
Something the current metric-driven system actively punishes. The institution, by prioritizing efficiency, certainty, and preserving its own comfortable structure, is actively sacrificing the open, critical, and imaginative principles that science requires.
And ultimately, the culmination of this deep dive is the understanding that science, for all its structural beauty and immense power, provides limited contextual answers. If we lack an awareness of that context, we fall into a dangerous form of dogma.
The philosophical position of pessimistic meta-induction reminds us of this limit. We have to be humble because the history of science is filled with fundamentally mistaken ideas that were once considered absolute fact. Today's fact is often tomorrow's artifact.
And this is why philosophical arguments, particularly from Quine and Duhem, suggest we can never truly prove or disprove a finding definitively. A finding is always embedded in a host of surrounding assumptions. If an experiment fails, it might be one of those unexamined assumptions that's wrong, not the finding itself. So we simply cannot avoid the exercise of informed personal judgment when we evaluate scientific claims.
So if immutable certainty is an illusion, where should we look for reliability and truth? The etymology of the word proof itself offers a really powerful clue.
It does. The modern understanding of proof is that of final, unassailable certainty. But the word historically meant a trial run, or trying something out. The Latin word for this trial, experientia, from which we get experience, it shares a root with the word peril,
Peril.
which suggests that experience, and therefore truth, is an inherently uncertain and perilous business that carries risk and requires continuous checking.
That is the complete antithesis of the modern scientific ideal of sterile, absolute certainty.
Exactly. The balanced approach to truth is anti-fragile. It derives value from context, it embraces evolution, and it accepts the risk of being wrong. But the structural biases we've discussed pursue a brittle, fragile idea of immutable certainty, which is just incapable of withstanding genuine intellectual challenge.
Which brings us back to the critical need for cognitive and institutional balance within science itself.
Science absolutely needs two modes. It needs the fragmented, technical, isolating mode for fine distinctions, for technical analysis, and for provisional certainty. But it must be guided by the other mode, the one that provides the imaginative insight, the synthesis, and the overall shape, the gestalt. The holistic perspective has to predominate to guide the technical contribution, to ensure that the drive for quantifiable precision serves a broader human understanding.
And when that critical balance is lost, and the technical bureaucratic mode predominates, the consequences are severe for the pursuit of truth.
Science risks becoming a fundamentalist movement, closed, defensive, complacent, and open to the specific forms of corruption we've examined, resulting ultimately in a lifeless failure of imagination. We have to admire science for what it can achieve at its best, but we must draw a firm line at the unrealistic expectation that it can provide ultimate, dependable, immutable truths.
The denial of its own limitations is what transforms good science into bad science.
A denial that causes a willful blindness to the flaws in one's own position. And this is the crucial takeaway for you, the learner. Science, when it's pursued with humility, is beautiful and good. Corruption and limits don't invalidate the entire enterprise, but acknowledging those limits empowers it by forcing us to engage in critical personal judgment.
So, having taken this challenging deep dive into the institutions that shape our knowledge, let's consider the personal application of this insight.
The political and intellectual difficulties we face today, the deep polarization and distrust, they often stem from the same lack of balance, this prioritization of technical certainty and efficiency over open-mindedness and context. So the question for you, our learner, is this. How often do you prioritize measurable efficiency and the brittle comfort of certainty over open-mindedness and the risk inherent in true discovery? And what great insights might you be suppressing as a result of that choice?
A deeply unsettling and necessary question to end on. That has been a comprehensive and challenging deep dive into the structure and limits of institutional science. Thank you for joining us.
And a special thank you to the Last Minute Lecture team for making this deep dive possible. We'll see you next time.